Okay. Um, so my name is Vandana, as he said, and I'm going to be presenting on communication and design today, and I'm going to get into what I mean by communication a little later on. But as he said, also I'm a cognitive science senior. Um, and just to begin, kind of an overview of what I've been doing here at Berkeley. Today I'm going to be talking about the introduction to cognitive science, history of information, and computational models of cognition, but I've also been involved in other activities on campus, Berkeley Innovation, what I'm sure many of you know about. And also I participated in a course called Human-Centered Design for Social Innovation, which was put on by IDEO, and I did that last summer. And also, there are several courses which I think have really contributed to human-centered design for me personally, including mind and language, social psychology, social cognition, and cognitive psychology. But first, I kind of wanted to pose a question, and it's that, has design always been human-centered? And I'm going to say no, and I'm sure you could argue with me on that. And that's primarily because before, people were really just kind of seeing people as the consumer or the customer, not necessarily a user or participant in the design. And if you think about it, that's really just thinking of them as someone who receives the product at the end, and at the end of the design and production process. Whereas now with the human-centered design process, we're really just thinking of the person as the user, the consultant, the tester, the co-designer, and they're engaged in the process at all times. They're participating with us at all times. So I found this interesting graphic, and it kind of shows you how design thinking has changed in design philosophy, because design philosophy, human-centered design is really just philosophy that we're kind of engaging in more now. And this really kind of adds to, sorry, I got really fancy with the animations, with IDEO's philosophy with hear, create, and deliver, hearing the user, listening to them, creating a design based on their needs and delivering it, and then going back into that design loop. And this is kind of what I think is the essence of human-centered design. It's understanding people as a whole, multidisciplinary collaboration, involving them throughout the entire process, and just making products useful. So what does this have to do with communication? And this kind of starts with the class that I'm taking this semester, which is the history of information, which at first I didn't think was going to be very interesting. But after taking it, I've actually realized kind of how information and information technologies and communication has really developed throughout time. So as you may know, or you've obviously heard this phrase thrown around a lot, we're in the information age. And every era kind of has had their resource that's kind of defined their time. You have the hunter-gatherers, printing era, the industrial era, steel, whatever. But in regards to information specifically, it's kind of evolved from writing to manuscript to print, and now we have technology. And in this class, we kind of discuss, what is an information technology? What is a communication technology? And it's really hard to define that. If you go to Wikipedia, you'll see this kind of long timeline of what an information communication technology is. And it's interesting because you see that they've included the alphabet and paintings and paper and scrolls. And that's when you kind of want to think about information and communication technologies as not just what we think of as like modern instances of the smartphone and Twitter and stuff like that. It's really anything that allows you to transfer information or communication. And it's interesting because a lot of these things weren't created with a user in mind. They were just created, and they kind of put it out there to see what happens. We read this really interesting article. I think it was Samuel Morse, and he was saying how he created the Morse code and he contributed to the telegraph, but he didn't really know how it was going to be perceived. He didn't know what it was going to do. He just hoped that it was going to work out, which is interesting because it's this idea. Oh no. Okay. There we go. This idea of technological determinism, which is not something I had known about beforehand, but in this class we talk about it. And it's the idea that technology actually dictates society, and we adapt to technology. And it's the fact that the user adapts to technology, which is completely different from human-centered design. Maybe it's the other way around, where there are human needs and information technology arises from those needs and society's needs. And that we create technologies based on the needs that users don't even know they have, which I think is interesting because why I want to talk about communication is that technology today really supports the type of communication we have. And it's specifically human-centered design supports our need for more advanced forms of communication. And when we think of communication today, we really think of stuff like this. With Google Glass and stuff like Venmo or Facebook or YouTube or even the iTunes Music Store for the transfer of music. And it's important to notice that for all of these, communication isn't really just one-way transmission. It's an interactive scenario. And that's something that in this class I've noticed and I realized is that communication was primarily just this one-way feed, and now we have these interfaces that we're interacting with constantly, and it's really changed how we think of design and how we design things, and why human-centered design has just become so critical. And that kind of brings me to talk about human-computer interaction, and how that's also become very critical because studying, planning, designing the uses of interaction between people and users and technology has become important as well. Okay, so that brings me to the second class that I want to talk about, which is CogSci 131, which is computational models of cognition. And in this class, we really just think of the brain as computer, cognition as information processing, or the brain as an information processing machine. And what we really tried to highlight in that class is, the mental models of the brain and how we can model the brain and how that's important in design specifically because we can use that to best design, an interface or a product. So in this class, we talk about how we can represent mental representations, then learning mechanisms for how the brain learns, categorization, inductive inferences, which is really just how the brain makes decisions, similarity, and also neural networks. So I'm going to give a few examples of how computational models of cognition kind of relate to technology now. And so I'm sure if you have an iPhone, you've used Siri, or you really hate Siri and you don't want to use Siri. But Siri is a really good example of technology that's advanced that we didn't have before, and also one that has used voice recognition and a feedback loop. And this is a really great example of how the brain works as well, how we recognize people and voices and integrate that in a network in our mind, and also how we receive feedback and learn based on that. And also Google Now. I have an Android phone and I love Google Now. It is so cool, but it's basically adapting to what you do on your own phone and the things you search for and what you want or don't want. And also a second example I have is just the swipe interface technology. I use this sometimes. I kind of find it annoying, but it's an interface. It's a good example of an interface that really shows prediction of our brain, and also a good example of a neural network and how we organize language, how we learn it. And it's cool because human-centered design is going to be more important in creating things like that, because if we want to improve these types of technologies, we need to develop a better understanding of these mental models and networks. So our mental models. So this is a big phrase we throw around in this class in understanding us as humans. Sorry, my laptop is going crazy. And we also throw the term personas around a lot in design as well. And it's important. These are really important because, mental models are essentially just cause and effect sequences. They allow us to have really good explanatory and predictive power of what a user is thinking and then what they're going to do. And so in order to create a really effective design, you need to understand a person's beliefs, attitudes, and then ultimately their behavior and how they're going to interact with what you're doing. Okay, Everest, you want me to connect really badly? Okay. So this is an example of a persona I created with Shafali over here on a project we worked on last semester. And so we decided to create this augmented note-taking application that you would use concurrently at a live event. And in doing this, we decided to think about it from Jim's perspective, and we thought about, who is Jim, what are his goals and attitudes and beliefs, and how is that going to affect how we design this application, and what we're going to include in it and what we're not going to include in it, to make it as intuitive for him as possible. Because all of his decisions are ultimately driven by his mental models. So this kind of leads me to CogSci 1, which is the first cognitive science class I took, and kind of what led me to this. But I'm going to just basically talk about kind of the things I learned and how I've applied them to some of the projects that I've worked on. In cognitive science, they really teach us about language and computer science, modeling, logic rules, neural representation, mental representation, and whatnot. So I've tried to apply those design principles, or just those principles in general, in what I've tried to create. So like I said, I participated in human-centered design for social innovation with IDEO, which is really cool. And we were told to create a website that would foster youth entrepreneurship, which is something that is not really a problem here at Berkeley, but it really is in other communities and colleges where they don't have those resources. In doing that, we really had to think about the people that we were creating this for. These were students who don't really have the resources we have. They're really not as ambitious, and they don't really have the validation that we have here. And so trying to think about how, what their beliefs and attitudes are, and how we could create a website that would foster that. And so this is my own redesign of the Craigslist website. And in doing that, this was for a class. And when I was doing this, I was really trying to think about my own design principles that I've learned, and that includes, similarity, closeness, just all psychology principles with proximity, figure-ground relationships, and also attention. Making sure that the specific colors are chosen to highlight call to actions and what's important. And also a project I worked on last semester, again with Shafali, who knows a lot about this as well. This is the application that we created, and it was important to, when we were doing this, we were trying to create an application that was going to enhance the user's viewing experience, but also allow them to save information onto this application and also use it at the same time. So we really had to think about cognitive load to ensure that there was a separation of that, and also mapping out our interactions on the application and if they made sense. And also, this is not something I designed. That would be really cool if I came up with this. But Facebook's face processing tool is really interesting, and it completely relates to information processing in the brain. And we've studied this in so many classes. I'm sure you guys have heard, if you're a cognitive science major, you've heard the phrase fusiform face area all the time. But it's a really good example of how we're using this understanding in technology today. So I want to conclude with this graphic cartoon, which I think really exemplifies, our community today and how communication has evolved, technology has evolved, and the way we use technology has really evolved. And it's important. And I think that the reason we've used human-centered design so much now as our primary design philosophy is because it's necessary if we want to improve technology. And I have another graphic too, which kind of relates to the first one I showed you earlier on. But yeah, what I've really learned through this course is that the technology we're moving towards and creating today, we have this growing need for human-centered design, and the technology we want to create, or that even I want to create, can't progress without human-centered design. So yes, thank you.